As a child, I once went to an event where a sister was talking about financial literacy and wealth planning. One of the things she said that always stuck with me was a house per child. The basic principle was that you should buy a house for every child you have. When they come of age, they will either have a house to live in or earn off of. Prior to this, you rent the house in order to pay for the child's needs as they grow. The principle behind this is fantastic. It's a little more difficult to action in practice, especially in this economic climate. But that's a challenge that can be overcome. I am now broadening my outlook in terms of how it can be applied. Property is not restricted to the UK, and we should increasingly have a back home focus in this world anyway. So I want my child to have some stake in Africa and the Caribbean. Either way, even if not property, there are other viable assets to invest in, such as land, which is not necessarily the same thing. This is a decision to be made. My son will go through rites of passage and be formally initiated into manhood, at which point he must receive at least 10,000 from me as an investment in his future economic endeavors. His account will be open soon. For now, we may use a bank, but with the African-centered credit unions being established around us, we should soon be able to transfer his savings to one or a few of said institutions. If I say this now, I have a goal. I also have a documented standard which he and others can hold me to. I don't just want my son to be economically stable, financially literate, and business savvy. I want all of this to take place in the context of serving and having an economic stake in his own world community, which means I must be involved in not only building businesses he can inherit, but communities he and others can inherit. Economic development is always more social than it is financial, which means I have to do better also in terms of my responsibilities to the families and the children around me. I know I have some work to do in this area. Time to reflect and self-improve. Tendawale, greetings family, welcome to another edition of the new Black Daddy Diary. We are back, yeah. I haven't done one of these for a hot minute still, so I want to give thanks, yeah, to everybody here that I've met out and about on the road and everywhere who has, said to me, yeah, you need to bring back this something, yeah, this new Black Daddy's Diary, and have, expressed to me what they've gotten from it, and their appreciation for it. I do truly value that. And if you said this to me and you thanked me for it, I've said to you, I will be bringing it back soon. So with day I know, yeah, and I'm truly appreciative and humbled by the fact that people have chosen to express the value of this thing, to me. And so I hope, yeah, that, ones and ones are pleased that we're back right about now. So as you know, yeah, I'm reflecting on, statements that I made and wrote down, thoughts that I wrote down in the weeks and months following the birth of my son, yeah, who is coming to be 3 years old in a couple months. And it's interesting looking back on these reflections now because this particular one, for example, he was just about a week old when I was reflecting on it and wrote it down. And so the interesting thing is that, what we're going to be getting is how I was thinking then and my reflections on how I was thinking then almost 3 years on. So this should be an interesting journey, So as a father and as a man, yeah, the most prevalent concept, yeah, that you might associate with what it means to be a father, yeah, is that you have to be a provider, all right? You have to provide for your them. And obviously in this reflection, I'm kind of, thinking about that, pondering what it means, yeah, to be a provider, and how to provide. And thinking back on this particular reflection today is interesting because I've been involved in a number of conversations about this providing thing, with friends and family and on social media and all these things. And it's an interesting one because my first reflection was the nature of the conversations that we're having about this concept of being a provider and a father. And because contention, drama, you know what I'm saying, and people life, yeah, tends to dominate a lot of conversation on social media, it just appears to be the case that a lot of the conversation about what it means to be a provider as a father, yeah, is centered around how much money a father gives to the mother of a child or children, yeah. And this is often because a lot of these conversations are taking place in the context of talking about broken relationships or relationships where the parents have separated and they are co-parenting and trying to figure out, yeah, how best to facilitate that co-parenting process. But oftentimes these contexts are contentious, yeah. There's a lot of argument and so on and so forth, and so the conversation gets boiled down to how much money am I giving mama, yeah. And whilst I understand, yeah, why that takes place, I think the shortcoming for the over dominance of that kind of conversation is that it kind of limits and reduces fatherhood and what it means to be a provider as a father, yeah. And so my reflection when I read this again was about that, like, what does it mean, yeah, to be a provider, and in the context of these conversations, you could come away with the impression that providing is about giving money, right? And I'm reflecting on this and I'm thinking, well, if I'm a father of a child and I provide money for the child, does that alone make me a provider? Yeah, and that's not to diminish the importance of the financial in the world in which we live. Yeah, you need to be able to financially provide for your children, but the question I'm asking is that the extent of what it means to be a provider? And for me, it cannot be. Yeah, and that kind of brings me to the reflection in terms of what the sister said, the auntie said at this event when I went to with my parents as a child, and she said a house per child, which means, yeah, you must buy a house for every child you have. You must buy a house. Yeah, interesting concept. So the idea, as I've said, is that every child, yeah, has a house, and when they come of age, they can either live in or they have an asset, yeah, through which to generate resources, yeah, in their adult life. And this was interesting to me. Obviously, you know, you're trying to figure out how would you facilitate that process, and the principle of it sounded good, you know, because obviously in a society in which we live, you know, you have to pay for their education and other resources, right? So this is a good way to facilitate that process. But also, what struck me as good about this is that it went beyond, yeah, reflecting on it now, is that it goes beyond just the monetary, yeah. It takes the conversation of what it means to be a provider beyond just finances, yeah. And I think this is important because economics, yeah, is beyond just money. Obviously, I was taken through a rites of passage program and formally initiated into manhood, yeah. And one of the things that we learned during the rites of passage program was about indigenous rites of passage processes, yeah. How our ancestors and our communities who still hold on to their traditions today bring particularly men into manhood, boys into manhood and girls into womanhood. And a key feature of all of these systems is the fact that you must provide resources, yeah, for the young person to establish themselves within the community. Everybody has a responsibility to be a productive member of the community, of the society, of the family, and of the nation. But the means for that productivity is provided by the community, yeah. It's also worth noting, yeah, that in a lot of indigenous societies, yeah, especially within our African cultural context, diaspora context, children in and of themselves and human beings are seen as assets, yeah, partly because of the fact that societies are, generally speaking, agricultural, and so more people means more hands for work the land, yeah? And so children are seen as fundamentally assets, whereas oftentimes in this society, having children is seen as a liability. It's an expense, all right? But also I think that indigenously, the concept of children being an asset comes from a place of intrinsic value, yeah, the Ubuntu principle. A person is a person because there are people. You know, and so it's a different consciousness, yeah, that children add value, yes, to your family, to your community, and are an asset in and of themselves, right? So even just that consciousness changes the nature of this idea of what it means to be a provider for me. Even though the family has a responsibility to provide for the children, the family exists within a communal context, yeah? So that providing and that production takes place within that communal context. And as the saying goes, Umuntu ungumuntu ungabantu, a person is a person because there are people. So the social communal context is very, very important. And this is given further explanation or exemplification in this concept called Ujamaa, which is a Swahili term. And for those who celebrate Kwanzaa, you will know that the word Ujamaa represents the fourth principle of Kwanzaa, which during the celebration of Kwanzaa is translated as cooperative economics. But in Kiswahili, the language here, which the terminology is taken from, it really carries connotations of familyhood. And that is because it is understood intrinsically within the culture that family is an economic institution. And I'm emphasizing this because I'm a universal African nationalist, which means I'm a Garveyite, a Black nationalist, Pan-Africanist, African-centered sensibilities. And within the movement, whenever we begin to talk about economics, yeah, oftentimes there are people that assume and limit and reduce all conversations of economics down to pursuing capitalism. They just think you're pursuing capitalist aims, private property, and so on and so forth. However, we're talking about societies and systems that were not capitalist. Our indigenous systems here of economics were not capitalist, and they still carried this element. And the reality is that we live in a capitalist society, yeah? So we have to find ways of negotiating that as a parent with certain ideals and certain proclivities. You have to find ways of negotiating that. And the way to try and do it, as far as I'm contemplating it now, is to have a social component to the economic development of children. And that's an essential aspect of it in terms of how I'm seeing rearing my son and our children, because we have a bigger daughter as well in our family home, all right? And yeah, that's how I'm seeing it at the moment. Which brings me to this interesting quote from Amos Wilson in his book, The Fortification of African Consciousness, yeah? He says, "We are suffering from the absence of an economic system. Money is not a system. Money is what it is. A system involves the systematic and organized utilization of money, a systemized utilization and distribution of money. Without the pattern, without the system, without the organization, one does not have an economy. An economy exists prior to money. There were economies in the world before money was invented. We do not even have to have money to have an economic system." So ultimately, when we study economic systems, we recognize that an economic system at its base refers to the nature of the relationship between people. It's the systematic way people choose to relate one to the other that makes an economic system, not money. Yeah? When we lack a systematic way of relating to each other, we can have money and still be poor. Have money and be robbed, which is what we are, right? So this is a interesting context, yeah, to put this idea in terms of being a provider and being a father. Why am I going into this? I feel like providing is about assisting my children in what it takes and what it means to develop not just assets, not just resources, but economic systems to operate, within. All right. So I have to have social relationships with other parents that share those goals and those ideals. And we have to be developing relationships between our children whereby they have shared assets and shared resources and shared means to develop economic systems. Within, among themselves, within their relationships. And those economic systems are going to translate into the families that they develop, are going to translate into the kind of businesses that they develop, or institutions, I should say, that they develop, and so on and so forth. And that's why I'm talking about this idea of credit unions, right? Because credit unions are institutions that are inherently built around the social relationships between people. So I'm hoping I'm making sense. I'm hoping ones are seeing where we are got, with this particular reflection. And there is an element of self-critique at the end here. I'm the kind of person that I'm very social, but in terms of that the time that it takes to maintain and develop social relationships, I can be deficient in that way, which is kind of why one of the reasons why I'm there with the woman I'm there with, because she's brilliant in that regard. She know how to keep in touch with people and develop social relationships between our children or her children and the children that are around us. So where I'm weak in a particular area, she's very strong, and that's the beginning of being able to fulfill this particular agenda for our children. Finally, man is very aware of my political cultural inclinations and the fact that we live in a society that is hostile to those political and cultural inclinations. And so the greater challenge is being able to instill these values and principles in our children, but also providing them roads to overcome the challenges that come with walking down this particular path, within this society. That requires an extra level of creativity that doesn't exist if your goal for your children is for them to just live comfortably in a big house. If you're trying to develop economic systems and social systems that are that is considered to be a threat, to the society in which we live, that's our next level thing, right? So, in conclusion, being able to provide for your children financially, as far as I'm concerned, in this society is a necessity, But if our goal is not limited to the society in which we live, then our horizons have to be broader than that. And as men, as a man, I have to look at my social relationship with my children as an aspect of providing. It cannot be cold, it has to be built around principles and values that I can only instill through interaction, through building relationship, and through being present, being a provider in terms of my presence, as much as my wallet, if that makes sense. That concludes this particular New Black Daddy Diary reflection. There will be more. I'm going to be keeping it consistent. Once again, thank you, humbly, Tatenda, Medasi Papa, to all those who have shared their value for this particular series, and I promise to keep it consistent for you all. Stay tuned for our next one. Hotep Tenamwali, Ashe, Ashe, Ashe.